Hi, I'm Stephanie Lemick, and this is the Building Trauma Informed Workplaces podcast. I am so excited to have an amazing guest joining us today to talk a little bit about their lived experience and also to talk about the work that they do. So I am going to kick it over to our guest without further ado to introduce themselves. Cytandra, great to have you here.
Thank you, Stephanie. It's great to be here.
So I would love if you could share a little bit about, you and your work. I always call it kind of the Cliff Notes version of your life story. That's hard to make a Cliff Notes version, but we'll try.
Any life, I think, is hard to put into Cliff Notes, but happily. So I grew up as the child of a tropical botanist. Grew up on a farm in Western Massachusetts. And then spent my whole life, my childhood, college years, and then the entirety of my career focused on social impact. And so I've traveled all over the world, had the great pleasure and opportunity to live in numerous countries and speak foreign languages. And then I've spent most of my career working with both the UN and the US State Department. And then the last decade working in corporate and for-profit entities. Now what I focus on is really bringing all of that together. So how to bring social impact with for-profit methodologies to focus on that intersection of impact, inclusion, and profit, and really be able to bring change and bring a difference in the world.
I love that. That's amazing. And not the most traditional childhood for most people, I would say. Tell us a little bit more about that, what that was, kind of highlights, low points, interesting points from that experience for you.
Sure, absolutely. No, I definitely don't think it's the most typical of childhoods. From pretty much every aspect. So I grew up on a horse farm in a house that was built in the 1830s with no indoor heating. It was like living in Little House on the Prairie we had, running water, but our heating was through a wood stove. So it really was very Little House on the Prairie-esque. And so that was kind of one side of it. And then the second side is my father's a tropical botanist. He's a world expert in begonias. And so ever since I was about 4 months old, I started traveling around the world with him on his expeditions, on his botanical expeditions. And so went to numerous countries with him, trekking up into mountains and the rainforest and remote places. But that really impacted me, all the way from infancy. And I knew ever since I was a child that social impact and anthropology were really at the core of who I am, and being able to understand people and cultures, and not bringing in a judgmental perspective, but really bringing in a true sense of curiosity to understand how different people think and act and cultures, operate, and the fundamentals of them. And so I had the travel bug. It was very contagious. And so started traveling on my own when I was, about 16 years old or so. And so I've done a lot and been to about 50 some odd countries and lived in about 15 to 20 of them, speak fluent Spanish, and lots of fun experiences, but definitely just being raised in a household that really valued the importance of family and understanding and new experiences and being willing and able and interested in stepping outside of your comfort zone. And then really that focus on impact, on, how we as individuals can do our part. And it doesn't have to be on a grand scale, but how each of us can play a role to really make the world a better place.
I love that so much. This is so interesting. I have like a million questions already. The first, and I am a Grateful Dead fan, so I have to ask, you've got a botanist specializing in begonias. Is his favorite song Scarlet Begonias, or does he hate it?
Definitely one of the favorites. I don't know if it's his favorite, but it's definitely my sister's and one of our favorites.
I love it. That is so fun. Oh my goodness. So my dog Scarlet is actually named after the song. So it's Scarlet like the color, not with the two T's like the name. So how funny is that? How fun. It's always finding connection. You mentioned a little bit about impact and, your viewpoint and your approach. And obviously, you've done a ton of amazing work in your life,
Just do what I
shaped
can.
by your childhood. When someone thinks about impact, I think when we think about impact, it can feel really overwhelming for each of us. I think about, looking to build a more trauma-informed world, more trauma-informed workplaces, and it's a big hill to climb. I'm talking about, changing systems and processes. That can feel overwhelming for one person. But at the same time, each of us is empowered and has control on, what actions we take, what we put out into the world. So I'd love to hear from you if you have a perspective on how each of us can focus on making an impact and kind of seeing that impact in the world. I would love that perspective because I think it's so important for each of us to consider what we can do in our lives.
Absolutely. And I think it's so important, right? We see in the news millionaires and billionaires and philanthropists, right, with almost bottomless pockets, who are the ones getting attention. Like yesterday, I saw Christian Bale is opening a huge foster, essentially like a community outside of LA for foster children. And right, so we kind of hear these large celebrities and large personalities who are doing the work with who have a lot of money behind them. But I think what's really important, and that's all really good and needed, but every single one of us can also make a difference. And I really think it starts with a sense of a shared humanity, and a sense of interest and compassion, right? That the world we live in has become so polarized. And I mean, you can almost take any topic, and the world seems to be kind of moving this direction of black or white. And there's reasons behind that. But I think what's really fascinating is when we try to step outside of it and really look at each other and look at us as a society and a global civilization as shared humans that are on this planet together. And it doesn't necessarily matter what your opinions are or what your preferences are. If we can really just look at each other in consuming this space together, that brings with it then this sense of interest. And so I like to use a three-prong approach that I came up with years ago when I was doing development work, which is care, change, and commit. So the first part is you really have to care about something, right? And that can be anything. That can be, animals, it can be the environment, it can be foster children, right? It can be, anything that you want, healthy food, right? I mean, pick your, better infrastructure for your roads, right? I mean, you can pick anything, but you have to care enough about it that then you want to do something to change it, to make it better. And then have that real dedication and that commitment to do something. And it can be on small scales, right? It can be everything from volunteering with local organizations to donating to local foundations to, mentoring students in, different schools to, donating food to a food pantry or a homeless shelter. I mean, the list is endless. And I think we kind of have this sense here in the US that the more is better, and that more is kind of the only way to do it, right? If you can't do a lot, well, don't do anything. And I think it distorts really what the impact is then that each of us can have, right? If we move away from the quantification of the impact and more just to those actions, even doing small things, an hour a month or a half an hour a month, right? All of that moves the needle, and all of that collectively is really what makes the difference. And so if each one of us choose to dedicate a half an hour or an hour, even a month, imagine what a difference that would make.
Yes, I love that. I love that collective understanding. Like, think how much that kind of snowballs that impact when we're all, work towards what we care about and we're committed to doing that. I love that three-pronged approach because it's such a great way to think about it for yourself. What do I really care passionately about as a place to start? Because it can feel overwhelming sometimes. We all have, work, our families, all the responsibilities that go with life. When it's something, you want to get involved, you want to get connected, how can you find that right space? I think that's so important. And I'm a big like more is more kind of person. Like sometimes more is great, sometimes more is just more. I think really taking a step back and understanding the collective effort, but also understanding the ripple impact that you can have is really powerful. I mean, it's as simple as I talk a lot about obviously mental health, I talk about trauma and supports. Someone simply asking, like, hey, are you okay? Do you need help? Like when you needed help, think about that interaction and what a change, what a difference that made to you in your life. Like I've had very like minimal interactions with people that have had really significant impacts on me, my life. So I think don't underestimate your impact as well, because I think there's just so much that we can do and that we can create together. We have the shared interest in the planet we all inhabit and are consuming. I love how you frame that. I think it's so important to consider that and be thoughtful because it is. We talk about big infusions of money. We talk about, these big, huge, large scale things, but really it's a lot of it is the choices that each of us is making every single day.
Yep, absolutely. And again, right, they don't have to be big things, but then there's also this balance, and I've had so many conversations with people about it, of that balance between self-promoting and sharing experiences to really for that sake of being able to share and to educate and to generate interest and passion. And so I definitely think that there's a component of that, right? People who go, to Haiti, working with orphans, and then it's all about, look at all this stuff that I've done, and, look at me as this, white savior and coming in and saving, right? Versus a little bit more of, what's the impact and how are you moving the needle and the change that you're generating, and what is the perspective and the voice of those on the ground, and what are things that other people can do. And so I think that there's a balance in that as well, right? Of, when that comes to trauma, nobody wants to feel like they're being subjugated. And so how you can talk about the work that you do in a way that's not making somebody feel like they're a subject in your dissertation.
I love that you brought up the concept of white savior. I want to talk more about this because I think it's really important. I think there's a nuance here, and it ties directly into being trauma informed. You're making an excellent point in that when we seek to help, how are we helping? What is our intentions? What's our why?
Exactly.
And are we creating choice? Are we creating a sense of choice, safety, empowerment, kind of pulling those trauma informed principles in? I'd love to hear kind of your take on, first of all, for our listeners, maybe they've never heard the term white savior, what that means and how it shows up, and how we can work to not show up in that way.
Oh, it's such a loaded question. I think I can kind of tell it almost more like a story. So
Perfect.
The first half of my career, I spent working, as I mentioned, with the UN, what's a department, a component of the UN called the International Organization for Migration, IOM, and then working with the U.S. State Department and USAID, the U.S. Agency for International Development. And it was what I had wanted to do my entire life ever since childhood, right? Of being able to travel around the world, work with vulnerable, marginalized communities impacted by severe trauma, right? Whether that's man-made trauma in wars and conflicts or natural disasters, and, earthquakes and floods and hurricanes and all sorts of things. And so the work was beyond fulfilling, right? I mean, I can't begin to describe like how my soul was fulfilled by doing the work. And now that it's been about a decade since I have been outside of the work, doing that type of social impact, but other work in this past decade, I'm able to look back on what I did with a very different perspective than when I was actually doing it. And there are some very specific examples that have come to my mind where the role that I played was much more one of, and again, I can really only see this from where I sit today, is I have been incredibly privileged. And again, I'm not trying to create a polarization or anything like that, but it's just my own personal reflection. And, I was very lucky to be able to go to a really good school and a college and not walk away with a lot of debt, and have family members and parents that were supportive and understanding and encouraging, but, also family that come from a very international background. And taking all of that with an anthropological perspective and then going and doing this work. And it's kind of hard to frame it, but it was almost of this perspective of, I'm coming in because I have the resources and the ability, and let's come in and solve all your problems for you. And so it's really only now, a decade or so later, that I'm being able to step back and say, was that really what the best thing to do, right? Is me, as someone who has no real context of being on the ground, trying to come in, and even though we're soliciting local opinions and perspectives and their stakeholders and decision makers, the actual decision making of what happens, how it happens, how much money goes to the work, was being made by mostly white people sitting in Washington, D.C. Yeah. And so again, it's really only now that I'm able to look back on that work that I did and say, is this really the best or the only way of doing that, right? And what other approaches can we take? And so that's really where I am now focusing the work that I do, is being able to take this retrospective, experience and learning, but all of those just incredible experiences that I had, and really think about, how can we achieve some of the same goals, but in different ways? Or what is, to your question, like, what really is the goal here, right? Are there different ways of doing it, right? Should our perspective and our desire here be to extrapolate the US around the world? Or can we figure out other ways to just incrementally improve some of the suffering, right? Maybe it doesn't need to be through the structures and systems that we have here. How can we do the work in a more culturally sensitive and locally informed way? And to me, that's what's really fascinating. And that, to me, is, I think, what some of that, you can call it white privilege, or you can call it, your own, kind of an ethnocentric perspective. You can call it your own training and background. But I think the critical piece is really trying to figure out how to understand your own experiences from a cultural perspective that you come from. And, whether you're working in other communities in the US or working abroad, how can you engage in those communities and be cognizant and aware of your own biases or your own perspectives, and try to walk into the situations with a much more open mind, and one that's really based on listening and learning and leveraging, rather than on, I want to take what I know and then put it onto you.
I love that. I love the self-reflection around that, because obviously very different scenarios. I reflect on my own HR career in a similar way. I think about work I was doing that I thought was the right work to be doing. I was trying my best, had the best of intentions, and looking back, I'm like, I would approach that much differently now, knowing what I know, recognizing my own privilege, understanding what I think the right way to do something is not always the right way. I think it's really important. I also think it's really hard to do sometimes, to really sit back and recognize, hey, I may have done harm. My intention was not to, but I may have done harm. I think it's important for us to do, especially when we, sit in seats where we're trying to help others, when we're examining our own privilege. And I'm big on, when we talk about privilege, when we reflect on our own privilege, it's a tool. It is a tool for us to navigate our lives and our worlds in a better way, like full stop, period. And it's so important. And I think it gets to intention and impact. And hard. It's so hard. So most of us, I think, genuinely mean well. We want to do well. We want to have a positive impact. Our intentions are good. I mean, most people, I think, doing, aid work, charity work, volunteering, their intentions are good. And I think that's why it's so important to also reflect on your impact and be open to real feedback on your impact. It's weird that I thought of this while you were speaking. I don't know if it's weird or if it's, apropos, but schools that were taking Native American children and normalizing them so they could have normal lives in our culture and our community in the United States. And, we talk about it a lot more now. But holy bananas, like what I think probably sometimes, if probably not always, but at least sometimes the intention was to help, to provide education, to integrate people into society was one of the most harmful things I can think of, like one of the most harmful things that was readily done to a group of people recently here in North America. And I say North America because this was done in Canada. This was also done in the US, and a ton of harm, a ton of trauma related to cultural erasure and just once you open the door on those experiences and what happened there. I live here in the Phoenix area, and there's an amazing exhibit at the Heard Museum about, these schools, huge systemic harm to communities.
Yeah.
And that's an extreme example, but that's why it's so important, I'm volunteering at a school to help, Native American children learn. Are you actually, part of a system that is perpetuating a great deal of harm?
I think that anything where the foundation is focused on erasure is where it's flawed.
Yeah.
I have lived, as I mentioned, right? I have lived and traveled in so many different places. And granted, my experience would be very limited, comparably speaking, but to think, for example, I lived in Colombia for a long time and I lived in Hungary for a year, right? Like to think if I went into those countries and the perspective of the locals was, well, the only way that she can live here is if we erase everything that she stands for, and then we're going to replace it with what we believe. The innate flaws in that concept are so extensive. I won't begin to go into them because I think, right, with that example, we can understand it. And so I think that's really, to me, what a key is that if the focus is on trying to erase or eliminate or replace, right, then that should immediately be the stopping point of saying, what am I really trying to achieve here? And I think, the U.S. has lots of different, metaphors we've used of, a salad bowl, a mixing bowl, all sorts of different things. But if instead it's on really, again, that understanding on listening and learning and leveraging, right, how we can take those experiences and add on, not replace, but add. And I think that to me is really what's so key and what's so critical is how we can really be able to bring people together through understanding and compassion. And honestly, kind of going back to your question on my own job and my experience, right? I'm able to do the work that I do now and have the impact that I do because I have all of these backgrounds, right? Because my dad is a tropical botanist, because I grew up on a farm, because I lived in so many different places and I worked with IOM and the UN and I did work in the private sector, right? If I had done only one of those, right, my perspective would be very, very narrow. And so I think it's a good way of looking at it. And, we have an immigration crisis here in the US. And so I think this is very apropos timing to have this conversation of trauma, and trauma goes on both sides. And I worked in migration for a very long time. in many countries around the world. And migration and migration crises affect everyone, right? It affects the migrants, it affects the local receiving communities, it affects the governments. So it really is not just one-sided, and there are lots of reasons why people migrate. And so, anyway, talking about trauma, right? I think that's a critical piece is to really just start conversations from a place of humanity, of compassion and listening and understanding, and then how we can use those experiences. So then try to figure out, well, what can I do to help out, not from this perspective of I want to change, but how can I just reduce the suffering and make it a little bit better, right?
I want to take everything you said about erasure and apply it to the workplace.
Okay.
Because I think so much of it almost, I mean, very different. But also, when we think about communities, we think about belonging culture. It exists on these big macro levels, within countries, religion, but also it exists very, intimate, small levels, locally within organizations, on teams. The old culture fit, culture fit. They are a match. They go along. And I think we all know, we've all heard all of the reasons why that isn't great. But I love the way you frame it around erasure versus the addition, because it makes me think of that culture ad. How can we integrate this person into our culture and be greater on all sides, that individual, that culture, because of it? And that's why I love that so much. I mean, I think it fits within any community, but I love thinking about that, from that workplace standpoint. How can we add versus erase? I love that. That's super, very insightful.
It's so fascinating. So as I mentioned, part of my background is anthropology. And so there's this fantastic visual within anthropology called the iceberg. And if this is a topic that's of interest to people, I highly recommend you look it up. And it's called the iceberg. And so it's this concept that what you see and experience in a culture is like the top 1/3 if you imagine an iceberg, right? So it's things like language and food and immediate interactions and how people dress and what music they listen to, right? But the real foundation of what that culture is the 2/3 of the iceberg that's underwater. Those are the things that are really hard to pinpoint. Those are the things that are really hard to put your finger on and say, this is how it's done. And so it's such a fascinating topic for me. But like this idea of a company culture, unless you're working, in a company that's 10, 15 employees or less, there is not one company culture. There could be some norms, right? Mm-hmm. But then after that, it really is dictated based upon each individual manager and department head in terms of how they communicate and engage with their team and how decisions are made. There's so many different factors and variables. And so this idea of, are they a good culture fit? That to me, and I'm a data analysis person, right? I come from a very strong data background, right? To me, that means, well, if you want a culture fit, then you need to be able to clearly document what the culture is. Mm-hmm. And so unless that is clearly somehow written and documented and everybody in the company agrees, yes, this is our company culture, I think that's a very difficult and very ambitious, misleading way of trying to portray a company. And I think what's more valuable is to talk about, here are some of our norms, and then really understanding what those nuances are between teams and departments and managers, and trying to push this perspective of, well, are they a good culture fit? It should be much more focused on, like, how is that communication, that integration going to be of this individual with all the rest of us? And so, I mean, I'm not Latin American, right? I'm from Western Massachusetts, born in a very white English spoken family, right? But I've spent so much of my life living and working in Latin America and speaking Spanish that, I can go down into one of the countries and kind of do a culture shift and speak Spanish and change. But that difference should not be about saying, like, are they a good culture fit, right? It's about how are we going to welcome them in, and how are we going to learn and appreciate, and what's the value that they bring, and what can they gather from us. And so to me, I think that's critical. Whenever I have been a manager, and I'm certainly not trying to like toot my own horn or think that I'm
you can please
manager,
do,
but that's what I love to focus on, right? Is like, what's the individual value and contribution that people bring? And, to the very beginning of our conversation, like their story, right? Like you can't cliff note somebody's life and story. And so making each person feel valued and contribute based on what their experiences are, I think that's what's really important, rather than trying to, make some identification if they're a good culture fit.
Love that so much. Oh my goodness, it's so perfect. So you brought up migration. Obviously, it is a hot topic. It feels like it's a hot topic all the time, but it's like extra hot topic right now. Yes, here in the US for sure. And I live in Arizona, so certainly close by to my community where I'm living. I think it's so hard to even engage in a conversation. I'll just be honest. I'll have my own experience. It's so hard to engage in a meaningful conversation about our migration crisis right now. Recently, a neighbor was stopping by, it came up. And, these are typically not conversations I try and engage with neighbors. But it was so hard for me because this person was just spouting biases and untruths. And it is very hard. I won't even repeat them because I do not think it's helpful. And it's, I think there's so much to unpack around that. We could probably talk for hours around it. But, for our listeners who do care, we go back to those three approaches. They do care about migration. They do care about folks who are, seeking to enter the country for reasons where they may have experienced trauma, or they're seeking, refuge for themselves or their families, or for whatever reason. How can we have an impact as individuals? Whether it's how can we engage in the right conversations? How can we support individuals who may be migrating? What are your thoughts on that? Since you're here and since you brought it up, and not to put you on the spot.
That's okay. I think, like, in most cases, what's really important in any topic that's highly polarized is to enter the conversation with listening, and to try to put judgments aside, and to really hear where people are coming from. One of the other jobs I did for a while when I was doing development work was in conflict mitigation and conflict negotiation mediation, in the Middle East, no less.
Oh, wow.
It's a story for another day. But I think what's really, really important is to just start the conversation both verbally and physically from a place of listening. Right? If you are having a conversation with someone who has a very differing opinion and perspective, and you're just there listening, but you have a very stern face on, that is going to convey far more than any words that you say. And so I think really, kind of what we were talking about before with the best intentions, right? That a lot of positions and opinions across the board, regardless of what side of an argument you're on, are informed by where you get your information from and what you listen to. And everything, to one degree or another these days, is biased. And so I think that just starting from a place of listening and of interest, of, well, tell me more, and what makes you think that, or, what are you doing, to learn more, whatever it is, but more of a conversation can really help to move the needle and make a change much more than getting into a confrontation with someone. And so, and I know obviously it's kind of easy for me to say while I'm sitting here. I mean, I'm outside of Chicago, and a lot of the migrants have been bused, up here, but certainly not affecting where I'm living. And I have family that are in Arizona near you, and are, working and doing their part to see what they can do to really help with the situation. But I know it's very difficult. And so I think it's more of really listening and having that conversation, and then trying to also kind of put yourself in someone else's shoes of why it's happening. And a lot of it stems from actions that are happening here in the US, like the drug crisis that we have here. Again, like, as I mentioned, I lived in Colombia I've lived in Colombia for nearly a decade. And a lot of the crisis in Colombia stems from the cocaine habits here in the US. And so, it's kind of try to understand both sides of the story. But I think anything where you try to start it from this perspective of, well, I'm going to change you, right? As we've been talking about, I want to change you. I want to erase what you think and replace it with something else. I think that's where a lot of the flaw is. And so if it's more of a conversation of, let's just talk and share and think of different ideas. And maybe we can come to this place where we both can, either meet in the middle, or at least we can have a respectful conversation to understand the other one's perspective. But anything where the intention is, well, I want to change you, we all know is not usually very effective.
It's so perfect because it gets back to what you were saying earlier about people being very black and white about things, or issues being very black and white. And I think that gets to, if something is black and white, you do get to erase. It is either right or wrong. And
Yes.
Most things are shades of gray in my experience.
Absolutely.
And it can be really difficult to navigate that. And I think the more we seek to understand in conversations, I say this all the time, and when I'm working with coaching clients, if you stop and your goal is to understand versus to tell or do or change minds, I think that is the most productive place to come from. And listen, sometimes I am not in a space to seek to understand. Like, full disclosure, I'm a feisty woman. Like, sometimes that's not where I'm at. And I think that's okay. Just know that that's okay, and understand how you engage. And if you decide to have an argument or change someone's mind, that your impact, to your point, your impact likely will not be helpful or productive.
Yeah.
So maybe instead you recognize this is not the right moment for me to engage. And that's okay. I think we got to this point. I blame Facebook personally. I'm just going to shamelessly blame Facebook. We got to this point where everyone's just kind of smearing these very specific and black and white feelings, comments, opinions about things all over. And we almost forget the human that's behind them, that a lot of times we even care about if we're interacting with them on social media. So I love that. I think that is so spot on. I want to, I'm cognizant of our time together. And one thing I really wanted to talk about today was, we've talked in previous podcasts about the concept of compassion fatigue or secondary trauma, vicarious trauma. Obviously, you have spent significant time working with individuals who have experienced significant trauma as part of your work with the UN. Would love to, if you're willing to share, share your experience on that, and, any reflections you have for individuals, who may be working in these spaces or maybe experiencing, compassion fatigue, secondary trauma from, volunteer work, gosh, even just the news cycle, any advice you have to offer as well.
It's a hard one. I think it's very personal. I mean, I have lots of examples. I mean, as I mentioned, I spent a decade working in development work with with the UN and the U.S. State Department with USAID. And in the midst of that, my focus was quite specifically conflict zones. And so that was natural disaster zones or war zones or post-conflict, meaning post-war zones. And so I spent a lot of time living and working in these very challenging environments. And I think ultimately that was one of the reasons why I left the work, was because it started taking such a toll on me personally, and being in war zones and conflicts, and, being in places where, Al-Qaeda militants are, coming down the street and you're having to be evacuated, or in zones where bombs are going off around you, where you hear of, colleagues that are being killed and kidnapped. And, it takes a toll, and it took a real toll on me, and in addition to a bunch of other factors. But, retrospectively, I think a critical piece of it is giving yourself grace and taking care of yourself. And I think that's much easier said than done. And again, I can say that because I've been out of it for nearly a decade. But I think that's really what's important, is you need to find the way to take care of yourself and step out of it for a while. And I also think there's a very fine line between, I think it's incredibly important to be able to do the work well. You have to be empathetic and compassionate, right? If you try to take that humanity out of it, you're just a robot. And then you see your beneficiary population and the people that you're working with, as numbers. They're not people. And I think looking at our U.S. medical system is a perfect example of that, right? Like, we go to see our doctors, and it's, check a bunch of things on a form, ask the questions that you have to ask, but there isn't that, understanding me as a human and all the pieces that might be going on and what's contributing, right? And it's not just medical factors. It can be so many other things. And so I think that there's a balance between being empathetic and compassionate, because those are really the skills I think that you need to be able to get, or some of the skills that are needed to get the work done. But at the same time, if you do it too much or for too long, right, that's where you get that burnout. And so trying to strike that balance, I don't think that there's a formula. I don't think that there is one answer. It's personalized to each individual, but I think just recognizing how to give yourself a break, and step out of it. And whether it's completely disconnecting from the news, or going and doing, an activity that has nothing to do with that work, so that you can really just kind of clear your head. But I don't have a magic wand for that.
I think there is no magic wand. I think that's the real challenge. We had a panel discussion late last year on compassion fatigue, and there were some great insights the group shared. One thing Catherine Manning shared that stuck with me was recognize the signs for yourself, what it starts to look like, what it starts to feel like for yourself, that you're kind of getting into that compassion fatigue, burnout-y type space. It was super funny. She shared for her, she started swearing a lot, which is like so funny. But I think there are these little cues for each of us. Are we starting to get, a little burnt out, compassion fatigue, having those feelings, and how you can kind of, oh, wow, this is where I need to press pause so I can continue to support others, so I can continue to do this work. And I think there's no shame in it either. It happens to all of us. I am so, so passionate about this work. This is, the Wounded Workforce is my passion project. This is my dream. And sometimes I get burnt out by it. Sometimes I'm like, oh my gosh, I don't want to do this. And it's just understanding and finding that right balance is so important, especially when we are doing some really challenging work, and seeing a lot of very challenging things and experiencing challenging things ourselves.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think also in that space, it's important to form relationships with people who understand.
Yes.
That was definitely something that I struggled with for a while, is wanting to talk about what I had experienced and gone through, with people who understand it. Because if you talk to people who aren't in it, they can't really grasp why it's so difficult. But I think that's really important, is finding people or finding someone, that you can talk to and share the ideas and be able to just vent, and let it out, and see what other, stories or tools that others might have. But I think not internalizing it, right? Being able to let it out is really important.
Absolutely. It goes back to that trauma-informed concept of peer support, having that community that understands where you're coming from.
Yeah.
And if nothing else, it's helpful to understand that you're not alone in this. You're not alone in those feelings. This was such an amazing conversation. I am so thrilled to have you join us. I am so grateful too for everything you've shared. If folks are interested in learning more about your work or working with you, what is the best way for them to follow you, follow your work, contact you to work with you?
Yeah, LinkedIn is the best. And then I have, all the stories and work that I do, and I'll link to my website and email, and everything is in there. But LinkedIn is definitely the easiest. And with an unusual name like my own, it's an easy source to find me.
Isn't it fun? It's there's one other Stephanie Lemick, but she already passed away. She seems like a lovely woman, so it's easy to find me too, which is a blessing and a curse sometimes. I don't know. And I will. I've included your LinkedIn profile in the show notes so folks can find you really easily. Thank you again. This has been such a lovely conversation, and thank you to all of you who listened in. Until next time, be well.